Good afternoon, I'm the Modern Warfare historian, and yes, we're back, after ages, with the Warfare Room Operation series. Sorry for the long pause, as I already told you, I was not feeling great and I had a ton of stuff to do. It does not matter now though, as we're back. Now, let's get started. In late 1941 and early 1942, the Japanese Empire conquered most of their research-rich Southeast Asia. The objective was to conquer as much territory as possible, therefore gaining a lot of resources for the war machine, and then hold those territories as much as possible by making the war costly in terms of lives, resources, and time for the Allied. In order to do this, the Japanese also needed to annoy the supply flowing from America to Australia, and the importance of this does not only explain the fighting in the Solomon Islands, especially around Tulagi and Guadalcanal, but also the Japanese drive towards Port Moresby. The first attempt to capture the port failed when Operation Mo was intercepted and the Battle of the Coral Sea took place. This battle, while being a Japanese tactical victory, it was a strategic defeat for the Empire of the Rising Sun, and if you're interested on why it was like this, we've already done a video on that. The Japanese tried again this time not on the sea, but rather through the Ower Range on the Kokoda track. That was a small passage through the mountains that connected Bunagona with Port Moresby. In the middle of the track there is a small village, Kokoda, that not only gives the name to the passage but also has a very important airstrip. Being the Kokoda track a logistical nightmare, the airstrip became a must-have for both armies, as that would allow the airlift of supplies and not rely entirely on people carrying supplies on literally their back. It comes no surprise that the Kokoda village was the place where one of the first major battles of the campaign took place, when the Australian 39th Battalion, that was part of the 30th Brigade, fought against the Japanese 1st Battalion of the 144th Infantry Regiment, 53rd Division. The battle was bloody, with both sides losing a lot of men and equipment, and in the end, the Australians were forced to retreat. Due to Allied air superiority in the region, however, the Japanese were not able to capitalize on the airfield, and this would become important later. The Australian A Company was ordered to go to Eora in order to rest, while E Company, under Captain William Merritt, was ordered to move up to Tiniki. This unit was fresh, but apparently inexperienced, and it was formed by the machine gun company of the battalion. However, the Japanese advance was halted for 4 days because they thought that they were facing a force of around 1,000 men, while in reality the Australians had a very small force in the area. This delay would prove to be a problem for the Japanese, as when they restarted the offensive on the 13th of August, heavy rain arrived. The Japanese attack started on the day before, the 12th of August, with probing attacks. That was basically a reconnaissance in force in order to scout the Australians' position. This was part of the standard doctrine for the Japanese, who were expert and violent in jungle warfare. After founding the Aussies, the Japanese started an artillery bombardment. The Australians had in the area, together with E Company, that guarded the left flank, C and D Company of the 39th Battalion. The Japanese attacked with a frontal attack, something that in other situations would have been deemed suicidal, but well, we are talking about a mountain track and I'm not sure how much space for maneuvers was available to the Japanese. Anyways, the Japs were able to endanger the Australian position by concentrating their attack against E Company, and Major Alan Cameron, that was the commander of the 30th Brigade, that took personal command over the subordinated 39th Battalion, was forced to call for a retreat. The Aussies were able to break contact from the Japanese and perform a good retreat by platoons, with the only problem that, because of this retreat, they had to abandon a good amount of supplies and personal belongings that were surely enjoyed by the Japanese units when they entered the now abandoned Tiniki. The troops of the 39th Battalion were able to retreat to Isurava, by the way, and we already know where the next fight will be. However, there is a small detour that is needed now, as something interesting is happening to the south. The Japanese were not the only ones that were thinking about going on offensive, as the Allied were thinking about that too. In fact, the Americans were pushing in order to create air bases near the southeast tip of Papua New Guinea. The reasons for this were mainly two. First, in case the Rising Sun Navy wanted to try another shot with a naval invasion of Port Moresby, they could be spotted and attacked by land-based planes. Second, the Americans and the Australians could launch air raids over Rabaul and other Japanese bases without having to pass over the Overland Range, thus making the trip safer, as the Papuan Mountains were, and still are, famous for being subject to bad weather with turbulences, something that is not very pleasant for airplanes and air crews. In the end, the choice fell on Milne Bay, and the soon-to-be base was named Fall River. It is funny to note that this created supplies issues when some of the material needed there was sent to another place called Fall River, a town in Massachusetts. A mixture of Australian infantry units and anti-aircraft guns with American engineers and anti-aircraft units were sent to the area to start the construction on the 8th of June of an airstrip. By the way, when I say Australian, I may be talking also about Papuan units, like in this case. The airstrip they had built, called No. 1 Airstrip and nowadays known as Gurney Airport, was created in order to house 32 fighters and have accommodation for 500 men. The first 3 planes from No. 76 LAAF Squadron, equipped with P-40s, arrived on the 22nd of June, while other planes from the same squadron and some from No. 75 LAAF Squadron arrived on the 25th. No. 1 Airstrip had some problems, yet it was still usable, but still the engineers started working on No. 2 Airstrip. However, after some recalculation, the project of No. 2 Airstrip was abandoned and work started on the construction of No. 3 Airstrip, also called Turnbull Airfield, in honor of LAAF Squadron leader Peter Turnbull. We will see later why. The Japanese, in the meantime, were not sitting idle. On the 3rd of August, during a reconnaissance patrol, a Japanese G4M Betty spotted what looked like an airfield to the west of Rabi, and 2 fighter planes around 500 meters above it. On the following day, that recon plane returned, this time with an escort of 4 Zero fighters, and an air battle started. 1 P-40 was destroyed on the ground, but the Japanese lost their recon plane. Still, the Japanese were able to find the following intelligence. The airfield is located 1 to 2 kilometers to the west of Rabi. The runway is from 1,200 to 1,500 meters long and 60 meters wide and runs east-west. There are coconut plantations to the north and south of the runway, and there are dispersal areas. There were approximately 8 P-40s on the runway, 20 P-40s on the dispersal area to the north, 7 P-40s on the dispersal area to the south, and around 11 P-40s in the air. There are 3 jetties at Rabi, with one 5,000-ton merchant ship alongside, and what looks like one 1,500-ton destroyer at anchorage. As a result of the air battle, 4 P-40s were shot down and 5 burnt. 1 Japanese reconnaissance plane did not return. Some notes on these results. The airstrip was around 1,800 meters long, yet only around 1,500 meters long were covered in pierced steel planking. The Japanese indicated 46 fighters. I do not have an exact number on the amount of OCs plane there. However, the Japanese estimate seems to be correct, considering that there were 2 squadrons, namely No. 75 and No. 76 Squadron, and that No. 1 Airfield was created in order to house 32 fighters. The ships in the harbor are probably there because on that very day, an American engineering battalion, -1 company, had arrived in the area in order to work on No. 3 Airstrip. Last but not least, the Japanese indicated that they destroyed a total of 9 planes. However, I found no confirmation of these from the Allied side that indicated just 1 plane destroyed on the ground. At the same time, it shall be noted that because the landing strip was not the best in the world, and because there were basically no repair facilities, there is the possibility that some planes may have been lost on the ground or could not be repaired. The Japanese recognized the importance of the airstrip, as it will make a naval attack towards Port Moresby very difficult, if not impossible, so they needed to attack. It should also be noted that the Japanese were starting to reconsider the possibility of a naval attack towards Port Moresby, and in order to do this, they will need Milne Bay, as a base there will provide air cover for the invasion fleet. On the 7th of August, an air raid of 27 G4Ms, escorted by 18 Zeros, was planned, but was diverted towards the Tulagi Guadalcanal area, in order to fight against the Allied forces landing there. This would prove to be a mistake, as 6 bombers and 2 fighters will not return from that raid. Also on the 7th, a smaller strike of 9 Valdive bombers was done against forces near Guadalcanal, and 5 planes were lost. However, because of the range, the 4 remaining planes were forced to ditch at sea, so all dive bombers were lost. On the 8th, another ice strike against Guadalcanal was performed by 23 G4Ms and 15 Zeros, and, well, this was a disaster, as 17 bombers were shot down and 1 crashed on the way back, and also 2 fighters were destroyed. Considering that the Japanese had, on the 6th of August, just 32 G4Ms and 33 Zeros plus other planes, these losses were huge, as around 8 G4Ms remained available. And we now all know that an air war rotation was not something that the Japanese would be able to sustain for a long time. On the 11th, the Japanese returned over Milne Bay with an attack of 12 Zeros. The Japanese had planned a bigger attack, but bad weather gave the possibility of only a limited attack. The Aussies welcomed them with 22 P-40s. During this air battle, 3 P-40s were lost and 4 Zeros were claimed by the Australians. However, the Allied had also another problem to face, namely malaria. In one of our previous videos, we discussed the effect that this disease had on the Japanese, and now the same thing happens with the Allied units. Due to a mix of causes like not having enough quinine, that is a medicine against malaria, the fact that mosquito repellent cream was ineffective, and the fact that the soldier exposed a lot of skin because of the uniform, it comes no surprise that malaria easily spread. The problem was so great that the 55th Battalion, that had in Milne Bay 2.5 companies as infantry garrison, was sent back to Port Moresby in early August. To reinforce the area, the 18th Brigade of the 7th Infantry Division was sent to Milne Bay. So the Allied lost a battalion, the 55th, but gained 3 battalions, the 2/9th, the 2/10th and the 2/12th, plus the 9th Artillery Battery of the 2/5th Field Regiment, and other signal and logistical units. The Allied have now, in the area, 2 brigades, the 7th and the 18th. The 7th had arrived on the 11th of July and was composed of 3 infantry battalions, the 9th, the 25th and the 61st, and were supplemented by anti-tank guns, anti-air guns and artillery. Because the 18th Brigade had actual combat experience, having already fought in North Africa against the Italians, it was kept as a reserve, while the inexperienced 7th Brigade was put as frontline defense against possible air landings and sea landing points of attack. And it shall be noted that the 18th also rushed to Milne Bay as the Allied codebreakers discovered that an attack was imminent. In total, the Allied can count on around 7,459 Australian soldiers and 1,365 US soldiers, for a total of 8,824 troops, of which 4,500 were infantry, while the rest were mainly engineers, anti-aircraft artillerymen, signal and logistical units. There were also 600 RAAF personnel. The Japanese were not aware of these and thought that the area was defended by a force smaller than a battalion, so they initially allocated just 1,250 personnel to the initial landings. Operation Ori, the attack against Rabi, that is a small village in Milne Bay, was initially scheduled for mid-August, but the sudden Allied invasion of the Solomon Islands on the 7th postponed the attack on Milne Bay. The Japanese not only had now to confront the Allied on 3 places, namely the Solomon Islands, the Kokoda track and Milne Bay, but they had to do this with a small force in order to not attract too much Allied attention. That would mean air attacks against your ships, the same things that happened in the Salamaua Lai raid that we have already covered. This also gave the problems of logistics, and we all know that the Japanese are masters in complicating the logistical situation. The Japanese forces were composed as follows: the 5th Kure Special Naval Landing Force with 612 troops under Commander Masahiro Hayashi, the 5th Sasebo SNLF with 197 men under Lieutenant Fujikawa, the 10th Naval Landing Force with 353 men, and the 2nd Air Advance Party with 100 men. These forces, totaling 1,262 men, were divided in two. The 5th Kure and the 5th Sasebo would land in Milne Bay, while the 10th Naval Landing Force and the 2nd Air Advance Party would land in Goodenough Bay, in order to attack the Australians from behind. The Japanese also had 2 Type 95 Hargo light tanks. Following the landings, the 10th Establishment units, composed of 362 men, would land in order to repel the airfields. The Navy, of course, did not only allocate their infantry, but also some ships, namely the 18th Squadron, composed of the cruiser Tenyu and Tatsuta, 29th Destroyer Squadron, with the destroyer Yuzuki and Oite, 17th Destroyer Squadron, with the destroyers Tanizake, Hamakaze, and Urakaze, the 23rd Submarine Chaser Squadron, with number 22 and number 24 Submarine Chaser. Some sources indicated that number 23 was present instead, but apparently number 23 was doing normal patrol and escort duties during the landings. Transport group composed of the transport Nakaimaru and Kinaimaru. On the morning of the 23rd, 16 Zero fighters attacked Rabi, but nothing interesting happened. On the following day, the 24th, as the invasion force left Rabaul, a bigger area engagement took place over Milne Bay, with 15 Zeros fighting against 20 P-39s and P-40s. Before you ask, I do believe that those were only P-40s in reality, as the Japanese simply were unable to recognize the P-40 Warhawks. Apparently, no Japanese fighters was lost, while the Allied lost 9 P-39s and 1 P-40. On the same day, 12 P-40s from number 75 Squadron attacked and destroyed some barges near Goodenough Island. The Japanese, on the other hand, reported of having been attacked by 13 fighters and that the ships were slightly damaged. This might be true, but it's worth to remember that because of this attack, the 5th Sasebo SNLF were left stranded on Goodenough Island. The raid also destroyed the unit's radios, supplies, and killed around 6 to 8 men. Most importantly, the unit's transport were destroyed, so the 5th Sasebo SNLF could not take part in the invasion. Still, on the 24th, the Allies sent 4 P-40s to strafe the Buna airstrip, and this attack destroyed 4 Zeros and 1 transport plane, reducing the available Japanese fighters to just 6. On the 25th, the Japanese started their landing in the Milne Bay area around Wagga Wagga and Wandeala. The Allies attacked the Japanese ships as they were loading the troops, and they destroyed the Japanese supplies of ammunition, fuel, and food. The invasion was not starting in the best way. And while the 6 Japanese planes were taking off in the morning from Buna, they were again attacked by 7 P-40s that destroyed 3 Zeros and badly damaged a 4th. The Japanese sent 6 fighters and 8 bombers from the Ball towards Rabi to support the landings, but bad weather forced them to land at Buna. The Japanese, in the meantime, having already landed and being with no air support, remained in standby in the jungle and started planning a night attack against the No. 3 airfield. This would later become the norm. During daylight, remain in the jungle in fear of air attacks and advance during the night. In the meantime, the Australians ordered the company of the 61st Battalion to move west, to take position near No. 3 airstrip, and their movement was done on 3 small barges. This was because the company had been placed in Isurava, and they were risking being cut from the main force as they were positioned too much east. 2 of the 3 barges were encountered by the Japanese. One was forced to beach and the occupants went into the jungle, while another was seized and 11 soldiers died, either during the fight or following their capture. On the 26th, the Japanese reached KB Mission that was defended by the company of the 61st Battalion. The Japanese attacked with their 2 light tanks, but the Australians were able to repel the attack even if they lacked AT weaponry. The Australians reinforced their position with the addition of 2 platoons from the 25th Infantry Battalion and with A and C Company of the 61st, bringing the total number of Australian troops to around 400 men. Systematic terrain prevented the movement of Allied anti-tank guns. The units of the 61st Battalion received anti-tank mines and sticky bombs. At 4:45 p.m., the Australians launched a minor attack and pushed the Japanese 180 meters back. The Australians then tried to withdraw, but the Japanese kept harassing the rear elements. The experienced 210th Battalion was sent as a reinforcement to the area. The 61st Battalion had moved behind the Gamma River, while the 210th was in KB Mission. In the evening, Japanese ships shelled the Australian position and the destroyer Hamakaze entered the bay in order to deliver supplies, but was unable to make contact with the infantry, and the following day it exited the bay. On the 27th, the Japanese air attack failed and they lost 4 Zeros and 2 bombers. Their objective was to attack enemy AA and machine gun position, but were unable to do any significant damage as the anti-aircraft fire was too big, as the Allied had at least 20 aircraft guns of various calibers, mainly the famous Bofors 40mm. The Australians badly planned an attack, and at 5 p.m. the 25th and 61st Battalion were ordered to move back after losing 18 men killed and 18 wounded, and an unspecified number of missing in action. Here we do have a problem, as some sources indicate that the 25th Battalion was near No. 3 airstrip, while the 61st Battalion was to the west of it. Our best guess is that the quarters of these battalions were there, while some units, like some platoons, were still in KB Mission. At 8 p.m. the Japanese sent their tank forward, and the 210th tried to destroy them with sticky bombs. However, the bomb did not adhere to the enemy vehicle, as there was too much humidity. The Aussies were able to repel 4 frontal attacks from the Japanese, also thanks to the artillery of the 2nd Field Regiment that was at Gilgili. Still, the fighting caused heavy losses to the Australians, and by midnight the Japanese had infiltrated the Australian defensive line. Also on the 27th, squadron leader Peter Turnbull, while on mission to find Japanese tanks, crashed in the jungle and died during the dive attack. The cause of the crash is unknown. It may have been due to gunfire, although there is the possibility that Matt locked his control surfaces, causing a high-speed stall. Squadron leader Bluey Truscott took command of No. 76 Squadron. Turnbull was an ace pilot with 12 aerial victories confirmed, 1 possible and 2 enemy damaged. In his honor, No. 3 airstrip will later be renamed after his name. On the morning of the 28th, around midnight, the 210th retreated in disorder to the west bank of the Gamma River. At 2 a.m., the Japanese units break the Australian defenses on the banks of the Gamma River, and by 4 a.m. some patrols were near No. 3 airfield. The 25th and 61st were engaged near KB Mission and suffered 43 killed in action and 26 wounded. The Australians retreated to the west side of No. 3 airstrip as it offered a good defensive position due to the open field of fire. At the same time, the Japanese lost their 2 tanks as they got stuck in the mud. At 6 p.m, the position of the Australians were as follows. The 9th Battalion was near the Gabuna Bay, while one of their company was just south of Gilikili. The 25th Battalion was south of No. 3 airfield near the coastline. The 61st Battalion was on No. 3 airfield. The 7th Brigade headquarters was north of Giligili. The 2 9th, part of the 2 10th and the 2 12th Battalion were on and west of No. 1 airfield. The 18th Brigade headquarters was west of No. 1 airfield. South of the 25th Battalion, there were part of the 709th Anti-Aircraft Battery and a company of American engineers. At dawn of the 28th, the Japanese started an artillery and mortar bombardment and attacked the airstrip, but were turned back by the 25th and 61st Battalion with the help of the 709th American Anti-Aircraft Battery. The next 2 days were with no fighting between the 2 sides as the Australians were busy consolidating their defenses and the Japanese were busy planning the attack and bringing supplies to the front line. The Japanese in the meantime were waiting for reinforcement consisting of the Kure 3rd SNLF with 567 men under Commander Yano Minoru, and elements of the Yokohama 5th SNLF with 200 men. To transport these units, the destroyer Arashi, Yayoi, and Murakumo, as well as No. 36, 38, and No. 29 patrol boats were dispatched. These units were escorted by the cruiser Tenyu and destroyer Tanikaze and Urakaze. The convoy was attacked by other planes with no success. A loading of personnel, ammunition, and supplies started on the 29th at 20 to 9 p.m. and lasted until 11:30 p.m. Meanwhile, the Japanese near the airfield were suffering heavy casualties, with the 5th Kure SNLF having lost around 50% of its unit and 10 casualties over the rank of platoon commander. Because of the Japanese reinforcement arriving by sea, the Allied commander decided to move temporarily the 2 RAAF squadron back to Port Moresby on the 28th, but returned the following day with the loss of 2 planes that crashed during the movement. It shall be noted that the P-40s were doing a great job flying hundreds of sorties to strafe and bomb the Japanese ships, supply lines, and units. By the end of the battle for Milne Bay, in fact, No. 76 Squadron would have done 220 sorties, and I do believe that No. 75 Squadron flew a similar amount of missions. On the early morning of the 31st of August, at 3 a.m., the Japanese launched their attack on the airfield, but were repelled by machine guns, mortar, and artillery. They tried again with 2 banzai charges, but were unsuccessful, and the Japanese suffered high casualties, including Commander Hayashi, that would later be posthumously promoted to captain. His successor, Commander Minoru Yano, tried to flank the Australian position at 4:30 a.m., but his forces were held back by an Australian platoon from the 61st Battalion, and were forced to retreat back to beyond the initial position, with some units retreating off around 1,000 meters. This was because the Japanese shifted to a defensive status, understanding that the enemy had more manpower and support than initially anticipated, and the Japanese had to wait for the arrival of the Aoba detachment that was scheduled to arrive between the 11th and the 12th of September. The situation was starting to change, but before we go forward with the operation in the Milne Bay area, we have to go north as other interesting military operations were taking place. As we already saw, the troops of the 39th Battalion were able to retreat to Isurava. On the 17th of August, the new commander of the 39th Battalion arrives, Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Horner, that replaced Lieutenant Colonel William Owen that had been killed near Kokoda. Horner was an experienced officer, having already fought in Bardia, Tobruk, Derna, and most importantly, in Greece. In the Atlantic State, he and his company, because at the time he was still a captain, fought a series of fighting withdrawals, while being pushed back by superior German forces. This was important as the fighting in the Kokoda track at this stage in the war were still delaying actions, and his experience in Greece probably was very important. Small geographical note, the village of Isurava is in the first real mountain pass of the Kokoda track, so the fighting around here will be an even worse nightmare for both sides compared to the fighting that already took place. In the meantime, the Australian reinforcements are starting to arrive to the zone of operation. The Aussies had, in fact, not only the 39th Battalion as part of the newly created Mauraba force, but also the 53rd Battalion stationed beyond the 39th Battalion, and this was another militia unit. The 214th Battalion, a veteran AAF unit, the 216th Battalion, another veteran AAF unit, and together with the earlier mentioned one, these were being sent on the Kokoda track towards the front line. The 227th Battalion, that was another experienced AAF unit that was kept as a reserve in Port Moresby, also to defend the port from a possible Japanese invasion. Some of you may have noted that some units have a number 2 before the battalion number, and this was used to indicate which units were part of the 2nd Australian Imperial Force. These were volunteers that could serve abroad, while the militia units, like the 39th or the 53rd, could in theory not do that. The idea of the militia was that it could be used to defend the home front, while volunteers could fight abroad. Obviously, when Japan attacked almost all of the Pacific nation in December 1941, the militia units were rushed to Papua New Guinea and other territories under Australian administration. The main thing that has to be kept in mind is that when you see a militia unit, its training can be very different from other militia units, while when you see an AAF unit, you could expect to see mostly trained soldiers with possible combat experience. If we talk about the specific battalions of the AAF, the 14th, the 16th, and the 27th, it should also be noted that these units had, in fact, already combat experience in North Africa, as these were part of the 21st Infantry Brigade of the 7th Infantry Division, and the brigade was under the command of the experienced Brigadier Arnold Potts. The Australian troops were starting to experience the harsh reality of jungle warfare. Limited rations, inadequate personal equipment, difficult conditions, and physical problems were all beginning to undermine their strength, and instances of disease were beginning to decrease their effectiveness in the harsh terrain they were being asked to defend. At this stage, the Australians' limited artillery sources were concentrated around Port Moresby, and due to difficulties in moving the guns forward along the track, the Australian defenders were left without artillery support. The Australians could only count on one 3-inch mortar, which was brought up to Isurava by the 214th Battalion partway through the battle, after it was airdropped at Miola on the 27th of August. Because of the logistical problems, the Australian units that arrived as reinforcement would be inserted in battle as first as a reserve and then committed company after company in a piecemeal order. On the other side of the jungle, the Japanese were having problems on their own. While their units were almost all experienced, they were having logistical problems as well that we have already discussed in earlier videos. The Japanese forces were composed of the entire 144th Infantry Regiment and the 2nd Battalion of the 41st Infantry Regiment, plus some engineering units. As big gun goes, the Japanese had two 75mm guns, two mountain guns, and two 37mm guns. However, because of the logistical problems, not all of these units would reach the fighting ground before the battle commenced. Also, the Japanese units were exhausted by the march into the jungle, as each soldier had to carry around 49 kilograms of equipment and supplies with him, while soldiers in the machine gun units carried around 56 kilograms each. The Australians were probably in similar bad shape, yet I do not have any numerical data on how much did they carry. The Allied were, however, helped from the air, as some supplies were airdropped, while the Japanese had to carry everything on their backs and on the backs of the native Papuan population. Brigadier Potts, in fact, was promised that 40,000 rations would await him at Miola, but when his units got there, they found only 5,000 rations. The initial disposition of forces was as follows. For the Australians, the 39th Battalion was stationed in Isurava. The 53rd Battalion was stationed in Alwala. The 21st Brigade headquarters was in Alwala. The 214th Battalion was moving from Alwala to Isurava. The 216th Battalion was stationed in the Abwari track to the other side of the Eora Creek. And for the Japanese, the 1st and 3rd Battalion of the 144th Regiment would attack Isurava along the Kokoda track. The 2nd Battalion of the 144th Regiment would attack on the Abwari track. The 144th Regiment would then reconnect at Alwala, thus creating a double environment of enemy forces. The 2nd Battalion of the 41st Regiment would remain as a reserve. The Japanese attack commenced on the 26th of August, and the front of the attacking forces was ambushed. The Japanese started a movement to the right, going up the mountains, in order to encircle the enemy, but were unable to gain substantial advantage. The attack continued for hours as it increased in deadliness, having the Japanese 3rd Battalion enter the fight after being initially kept behind the first one as a sort of reserve, but the 39th Battalion and the 240th Battalion were holding their ground. On the other side of the ridge, however, the Japanese attack was going good, after they were able to dislodge the small elements of the 53rd Battalion stationed there, and probably these elements were company sized, and if I had to guess, these were part of C Company. The Japanese were able to bypass the 53rd Battalion position and were successful in killing some senior officers of the battalion, including Lieutenant Colonel Kenneth Ward, the battalion commanding officer. Because of this, the communication between the companies broke down and the 53rd began to fall back in a non-organized way. What limited information reached Potts' headquarters was not making him happy, and he decided to send some companies of the experienced 216th Battalion as a reinforcement. The Japanese, however, were not able to use their advantage as they had to slow down because the troops were battle fatigued. By the way, some of you hopefully have noticed that I've started using a specialized software for military maps, and I would like to thank the team behind map.army that created this. All these maps will be hopefully available on our website. This is the situation on the afternoon of the 29th of August. The 39th Battalion and the 240th Battalion are holding around Isurava against the 1st Battalion, 144th Regiment. The Japanese 3rd Battalion is encircling the Australian position at Isurava. The Japanese 2nd Battalion is around Abuari. The Australians have 3 companies southwest of Abuari, those being Company A and B of the 216th and the Company of the 53rd Battalion. Just east of the Eora Creek, there is the headquarters of the 216th Battalion, while the headquarters of Brigadier Potts is in Alwala, together with the rest of the 53rd Battalion. The 2nd Battalion of the 41st Regiment is starting being brought to the front line near the 2nd Battalion 144th Regiment. This was because the Japanese realized that the defenses at Isurava were too big to dislodge frontally, so they needed to encircle them from the east with the 3rd Battalion and from the southwest with the 2nd Battalion of both the 144th and the 41st Regiment. Potts notices that he is in a very precarious situation and asks for the transfer of the 227th Battalion to the front, but the request is denied. The 227th will remain in Port Moresby. On the 30th of August, Potts ordered the 39th Battalion and the 214th Battalion to start withdrawing from Isurava to Alwala. The fighting here was very violent, with numerous instances of hand-to-hand combat and engagement at point-blank range with grenades. This battle had been described by both factions as almost a nightmare, as the 4 days engagement was done in thick jungle with heavy torrential downpours, with no clear front lines, that caused some instances of friendly fire incidents. The battle was composed of various attacks and counterattacks, for example what happened on the 29th of August near the headquarters of the 214th. The Japanese had broken through the right flank, pushing the Australians back with heavy fire and threatening to cut off their headquarters. The Aussies began to prepare a counter-offensive and men volunteered to join an attack party. Private Bruce Kingsbury, one of the few survivors of his platoon, the 9th Platoon, ran down the track with the group. You could see his brain gun held out and his big buttons roaring as he went with the momentum he was getting up, followed by Alan Avery. They were very cheerful. They were going out on a picnic, almost, would later write Lieutenant Colonel Phil Rorden in The Spirit of Kokoda. With the brain gun that he had taken from wounded Corporal Lindsay Breer, Kingsbury, alongside Avery and the rest of the group, engaged the nearby Japanese soldier. The fire was so heavy that the undergrowth was completely destroyed within 5 minutes. It was then that Kingsbury, firing from his hip, charged straight at the Japanese. He came forward with this brand and he just mowed them down. He was an inspiration to everybody else around him. There were clumps of Japs here and there and he just mowed them down, wrote Private Alan Avery, Spirit of Kokoda. His actions demoralized the Japanese, killing several and forcing others to find cover. The rest of the Australian group, inspired by Kingsbury's action, forced the Japanese further back into the jungle. Kingsbury was then shot and mortally wounded by a Japanese sniper. Avery, who had been about 6 feet, that is 1.8 meters, from Kingsbury, briefly chased after the sniper, but returned to carry Kingsbury to the regimental aid post. But Kingsbury was dead by the time he arrived there. Kingsbury's actions were described as a turning point in the battle. The Japanese had begun to gather momentum in their attack and were threatening to overrun the 214th headquarters. His attack inflicted substantial damage to the Japanese force, temporarily halting their advance. This allowed the Australian troops to stabilize their position, eventually regaining control and defending the battalion headquarters. However, the battle ended in defeat for the Australians, with elements of the 214th breaking during the afternoon of the 29th of August. The remainder of the battalion managed to withdraw during the night, but suffered heavy casualties and another defeat during fighting the next day at position around the Isurava guest house, that was a small house on the Kokoda track south of Isurava. Some authors and analysts have speculated that had Kingsbury not attacked, the Japanese might have destroyed both the 39th and the 214th Battalion by encircling them. The Australians were low on supplies and the Japanese were on the verge of breaking through the Australian line. Had they broken through, they would have been able to isolate the battalion headquarters from their soldiers on the flank. This would have prevented the Australians from retreating to Aloala, allowing the Japanese to overrun them. For his actions, Kingsbury was awarded the Victoria Cross, which was gazetted on the 9th of February 1943. His citation read, and I quote, "War Office, 9th of February 1943. The King has been graciously pleased to approve the posthumous award of the Victoria Cross to number VX19139, Private Bruce Steele Kingsbury, Australian Military Forces. In New Guinea, the battalion to which Private Kingsbury belonged had been holding a position in the Isurava area for 2 days against continuous and fierce enemy attacks. On the 29th of August 1942, the Japanese attacked in such force that they succeeded in breaking through the battalion's right flank, creating a serious threat both to the rest of the battalion and to its headquarters. To avoid the situation becoming more desperate, it was essential to regain immediately the lost ground on the right flank. Private Kingsbury, who was one of the few survivors of a platoon which had been overrun and severely cut about by the enemy, immediately volunteered to join a different platoon which had been ordered to counterattack. He rushed forward, firing his brain gun from the hip through terrific machine gun fire, and succeeded in clearing a path through the enemy, continuing to sweep the enemy position with his fire and inflicting an extremely high number of casualties on them. Private Kingsbury was then seen to fall to the ground, shot dead by the bullet from a sniper hiding in the wood. Private Kingsbury displayed a complete disregard for his own safety. His initiative and superb courage made possible the recapture of the position, which undoubtedly saved battalion headquarters, as well as causing heavy casualties amongst the enemy. His coolness, determination, and devotion to duty in the face of great odds was an inspiration to his comrades. Kingsbury was the first Australian soldier to be awarded the Victoria Cross for actions in the South Pacific, and also the first on Australian territory. Kingsbury Rock, the rock next to which Kingsbury died, stands within sight of where the 214th Battalion headquarters had been established, and has been incorporated as part of the Isurava Memorial. His body now rests in the Balmoral Cemetery in Port Moresby, and his Victoria Cross is on display at the Australian War Memorial in Canberra. The Melbourne suburb of Kingsbury was named in his honour, as was the rest area on the Memers Driveway and a street in the Canberra suburb of Galway. In the end, the Japanese were able to push back the Aussies from Isurava, also thanks to artillery support, but were able to do this after very heavy losses. On the 30th, the 39th Battalion and the 214th entrenched themselves halfway between Isurava and Aloala, while being under attack from both the 1st Battalion 144th Regiment and the 3rd Battalion, that had just arrived from the northern detour and tried to encircle the Australian forces. Again, violent close-quarter fighting erupted, and the battle soon became a fight for survival, with a lot of small unit action. Sadly for some Australians, this chaos, also fueled by some friendly fire incident, had resulted that some units tried to withdraw to the mountains, with some of them never to be seen again. Some of the Aussies were captured, including the 214th commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Samuel Key, who was then executed after his interrogation. On the morning of the 31st of August, the Japanese were able to enter the now abandoned Isurava village, where they found a lot of supplies badly needed, especially food and the best weapon in this campaign, grenades, with around 400 of them being captured in Aurora. Losses were around 99 killed and 111 wounded for the Australians, and for the Japanese, 140 killed and 231 wounded. I do believe that these numbers do not include the dozen of Allied soldiers that were captured and later executed by the Japanese. In the end, the Australians were able to hold off the Japanese for some days, but when the front started to collapse, it did rapidly, and the Aussies left Isurava in a non-organized route, as they retreated again towards Port Moresby. As the Aussies retreated, they were kept under pressure by the Japanese units. Lieutenant General Hoy assigned the 2nd Battalion of the 31st Regiment to the task of pursuing the Australians. The Japanese could muster 3 companies of the battalions, while the 7th Company and the 144th Regiment were positioned behind them in order to have some rest and, in case it would be needed, act as a reserve. To confront them, the Australians placed the 216th Battalion as a rearguard, although some elements of the 214th would be used as well. The series of small engagement is not well documented, sadly, so there is not enough information on the matter, but this is what we understood. By midday on the 1st of September, the 216th was placed in a defensive position just south of Eora village. The 39th Battalion was in the Eora village and was in the process of abandoning it, while the 214th was around 1 kilometer south of the 216th. If you're asking where is the 53rd Battalion, good question. As far as we understood, C Company was with the 240th Battalion, while the main body of the battalion was on the triangle between Miola, Kaji, and Efoji. As the 39th abandoned Eora village, after being ordered to Kaji, the Japanese started their attack with the help of the artillery. 2 Japanese companies attacked from the east, but the Australians were able to hold their ground. At 6 am, the 216th retreated as planned towards a position 1 kilometer north of Templeton's crossing, and the Japanese started to probe the 214th as well as some probing attacks against the 216th. The Japanese tried to flank the Australians, but the AAF units were able to hold their position. The 214th was retreated to a position called Dump 1, and on the 3rd of September they were relieved by the 216th, with the 214th being ordered to Miola. As the Japanese kept contact with the Australian troops, the 216th was also ordered back to Miola, this time being able to break contact. Brigadier Potts then decided that the units should abandon Miola and move further towards Efoji, also because the 227th, that previously was in Port Moresby as a garrison, had been granted permission to join Potts' forces. This series of engagement costed the Japanese 43 killed and 58 wounded, even if some sources indicate 40 deaths and 53 injured. The Australians suffered 21 killed and 54 wounded in action. The battles near Templeton Crossing could be described as an Australian victory, as they were able to withdraw under pressure and, most of the time, kept an orderly retreat. The Japanese, on the other hand, failed to destroy the Australian units, and the 31st Regiment would then be heavily criticized for its slow advance. After this small engagement, the 144th Regiment would then be repositioned as a spearhead of the advance, while the 2nd Battalion of the 31st Regiment would remain as a reserve. The Japanese were able to capture some supplies at Miola. They had been used previously as a supply drop point, but some of the food there had been apparently poisoned. The units of the Emperor of the Rising Sun also started reporting that there were a lot of instances of Allied planes strafing them, although these did not cause any fatalities yet. Japanese also had another problem, as Colonel Kusunose Masao, commander of the 144th Regiment, had just fell ill and had to be brought away from the front line. But still, the Japanese were advancing towards Port Moresby. Let's now return to a place where the Japanese stopped advancing, Milne Bay. We left this area after the Japanese attack on the morning of the 31st failed, also thanks to the heavy firepower of the Allied. The Allied now passed on the offensive. The 212th Battalion was brought forward, and at 9 am they moved forward from No. 3 Airstrip. The Australians were being targeted by snipers and small ambushes, some even made by Japanese soldiers who faked being dead. In order to fight against these tactics, the Australians started killing all their enemies that were either dead or faking being one. To quote from Sergeant Arthur Trail of the 212th, lying across the airstrip were dozens of dead Japs. As our officer crossed in the vanguard, a Jap, apparently wounded, cried out for help. The officer walked over to aid him, and as he did, the Jap sprang to life and hurled a grenade which wounded him in the face. From then on, the only good Jap was a dead one, and although they tried the same trick again and again throughout the campaign, they were dispatched before they had time to use their grenade. Our policy was to watch any apparent dead, shoot at the slightest sign of life, and stab with bayonets even the ones that appeared to be rotten. It was all out from then on, neither side showing any quarter, and no prisoners were taken. Together with A and C Company of the 9th Battalion, the Australians were able to advance. Later on the 31st, units of the 212th did a bayonet charge to conquer KB Mission, killing and wounding a total of 60 Japanese troops. By 6 p.m, the units that were counter-attacking were as follows. 2 companies of the 212th were at Rabi, while the rest of the battalion was in KB Mission. A company of the 9th Battalion was on the east bank of the Gamma River. C Company of the 9th Battalion was between Kitalbo and Rabi. During the night, between the 31st of August and the 1st of September, a force of around 300 Japanese soldiers tried to escape with infiltration tactics from being encircled near the Gamma River. However, the Japanese suffered a lot of casualties, some estimating even around 90 deaths. Other Japanese units started harassing the Australians at KB Mission in order to distract the Allied forces and give the brothers in arms a chance to exfiltrate. The Japanese efforts, both in the exfiltration and the attack on KB Mission, were hampered by heavy rains, but I do believe that this detail could now be implicit, as it appears it almost always rains there. At 5:30 am on the 1st of September, 6 Zeros and 5 light bombers were sent to provide support over Rabi, but bad weather while en route turned them back. At the same time, it appears that the skies over Wagga Wagga were clear, as 7 P-40s attacked the Japanese headquarters stationed there with strafing guns. On the 2nd of September, the 29th Battalion was brought forward by barges to KB mission, and it started to advance towards the Japanese headquarters. The Jap situation was, at this time, not bad, worse. The Eora detachment, scheduled for arrival on the 11th of September, composed by an infantry battalion and an artillery company, was needed in order to have a chance in successfully attacking the airfield. However, there was a real possibility that when it would arrive, the Japanese units there would have already been defeated. In order to help the units there, the Yokosuka 5th SNLF was dispatched to the area. This was a company-sized formation with 130 men under Captain Yasuda Yoshitatsu, who was also tasked with taking command of the entire force that had landed in Milne Bay. These units left Rabaul on the morning of the 2nd of September on number 39 patrol boat and escorted by some units of the 4th Destroyer Squadron and the Hamakaze. Because Commander Yano, who was commanding the landing forces, sent a report indicating that an enemy transport and a cruiser had entered the bay, the Japanese organized a response in force. The Hamakaze was rushed to the area, while number 39 patrol boat, with the Yokosuka 5th SNLF, had to postpone the landing to the following day under the cover of the Tsatsuda. The 25th Air Flotilla sent to the area 3 carrier-based bombers, 9 Zeros, 5 G4Ms and 1 flying boat, but because of the weather, they were forced to turn back, and the 3 carrier-based bombers were lost. In the evening of the 2nd of September, the Hamakaze and the Arashi had reached Milne Bay, but found no Allied ships in the area. The commander of the 4th Destroyer Squadron reported the following at 10 p.m. No sign of enemy surface craft. Land battles continuing from Rekinara area to near the airfield. Enemy attack considered intense owing to numerous mortar flashes and traces visible at night. It seems Japanese units are scattered and grimly holding on. Battles also underway to the west of the original landing position. It is considered that there is a high chance that the landing tomorrow will be conducted in face of the enemy. An hour and a half later, he sent the following report that highlights how the Japanese situation was deteriorating by the hour. Arrived at the China Strait at 1800 hours and searched for enemy from south of the entrance of the harbor, up to the landing point. After contact made with the landing party, again searched for the enemy at the north of the harbor, but found nothing. Hamakaze dispatched a launch to attempt to establish communication with the landing party, but failed to do so and returned to ship. The launch was detached from land when signal lamps were used, indicating that the Japanese landing party had withdrawn. The land battle seemed to have entered a lull after 2200 hours, with only an occasional flare-up. Communication not yet established with the Kure 3rd Special Naval Landing Party, said to be positioned 3 kilometers east of Abi, owing to heavy rain and poor visibility since morning. Position of enemy ship also unknown, so withdrew at 100 hours on the 3rd of September. Earlier that afternoon, the commander of the Kure 3rd SNLF sent this report. We have reached the worst possible situation. We will together calmly defend our position to the death. We pray for the absolute victory, for the Empire, and for long-lasting fortune in a battle for you all. In the meantime, the Australians were trying to advance as much as possible. On the 3rd of September, the 29th engaged the Japanese to the west of Elevada Creek, but suffered 34 casualties. The Austrians had tried to cross the creek with 2 platoons, but the Japanese machine guns prevented them from achieving their objectives. Elements of another company tried the same move further north sometime later, and when they did, they found the Japanese had retreated, leaving behind 20 Japanese dead soldiers. In the afternoon, the 29th advanced until Sanderson's Bay, where they entrenched themselves for the night. During the night, Japanese ships shelled the area, but were unable to make any casualties. The Japanese were, however, able to evacuate some of the wounded. This was the Japanese situation at around midday. Commander Kure 5th Special Naval Landing Party killed in action. Commander Kure 3rd Special Naval Landing Party seriously wounded. Adjutant Kure 3rd Special Naval Landing Party, senior officer in battle, lightly wounded. Fully fit warrant officer and higher ranks down to 1/3 strength. NCOs and men approximately 560 remain, around 200 capable of battle. Fuikawa unit, including construction room, all fit. The following day, the 29th advanced again, when its forward company being engaged at Goroni. At 3:15 p.m., they launched their attack. One of the Australian section was under fire by 3 machine guns, and it was at this moment that Corporal John French, a 28-year-old from Queensland, decided he had to act. He ordered the others of his section to take cover, while he destroyed 2 machine guns with grenades and attacked the 3rd with his Thompson submachine gun. The Japanese firing ceased and the Australian section advanced to find that the machine gunners had been killed and that French had died in front of the third position. He was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross with the following citation. At Milne Bay, New Guinea, on the afternoon of the 4th of September 1942, a company of Australian Infantry Battalion attacked the Japanese position where it encountered terrific rifle and machine gun fire. The advance of the section, of which Corporal French was in command, was held up by fire from 3 enemy machine gun posts, whereupon Corporal French, ordering his section to take cover, advanced and silenced one of the posts with grenades. He returned to his section for more grenades and again advanced and silenced the second post. Armed with a Thompson submachine gun, he then attacked the third post, firing from the hip as it went forward. He was seen to be badly wounded by fire from this post, but he continued to advance. Enemy guns then ceased fire and his section pushed on to find that all members of the 3 enemy gun crews had been killed, and that Corporal French had died in front of the third gun pit. By his cool courage and disregard for his own personal safety, this non-commissioned officer saved members of his section from heavy casualties and was responsible for the successful conclusion of the attack. In his honor, the library at Crow's Nest is called John French VC Memorial Library, and the Corporal John Alexander Jack French VC Estate in Guyton, Brisbane, is named in his honor too. By the end of the 4th, the Japanese had only around 50 soldiers fit for combat, while the others were in some shape or form injured. Almost all the seriously wounded had killed themselves, while those unable to walk were fighting sitting down in the trenches. All the company commanders had been killed, and only 3 or 4 platoon leaders remained. On the bright side, the Japanese Navy was able to evacuate 224 wounded. On the 5th, the Japanese High Command ordered a withdrawal that was started on the evening. On that day, 6 BU fighters from No. 100 Air AAF Squadron arrived at Milne Bay, and the following day, 3 more BU fighters from No. 30 Air AAF Squadron arrived. Also on the 6th, the Australians were able to reach the Japanese main camp and were able to conquer it after some small skirmishes. In the evening, the Japanese cruiser Tenyu and the destroyer Arashi entered Milne Bay and opened fire on the Australian position at Gili Gili and Wagga Wagga. They also opened fire on the 3,000 plus ton cargo ship Anshun that was unloading cargo, hitting her 10 times, killing 2 and wounding 2, before she rolled on her side. The following night, another naval bombardment caused some casualties in the Australian ranks, and this was the Japanese last action in the Battle of Milne Bay. In total, the Japanese were able to evacuate 1,318 troops, of which 311 wounded. 625 men did not return, with 311 of these being confirmed killed in action. Combined Fleet Chief of Staff Vice Admiral Ugaki recorded the following as the reason for the failure in Milne Bay. First, the fact that the enemy airfield was heavily defended and our landing party could not capture it. Second, the fact that we charged into operation in addition to the attack on Port Moresby while we were at a loss over the issue of the Canal, thus dispersing our strength over to the operation. Third, the fact that the naval landing party was not of high caliber, as it contained numerous 30-35 years old conscripts with poor endurance and inferior fighting spirit. The movement of operation were also inadequate, with thrust from the north and south unable to act in concert. Fourth, the fact that the high rainfall resulted in many with foot sores in the muddy condition, and that air support could not be expected owing to poor weather. However, the Japanese had another problem now. Remember the unit that was left stranded on Goodenough Island, the 350-strong 10th Naval Landing Force called Tsukioka Unit? Well, the Japanese commanders thought that these units had landed on the coast of Taupota on the 26th of August and had reached position north of Rabi by the 30th. In reality, they were left stranded on Goodenough Island since the 25th, having all their 7 barges and the single radio being destroyed. They were able to send a group of messengers on canoes that reached friendly position at Buna on the 9th of September, and only then the Japanese realized what happened to their unit. On the following day, the Japanese sent 2 destroyers, the Yayoi and the Izokadze, to rescue the unit. However, 10 US AAF bombers attacked the ships and the Yayoi was damaged and sunk north of Normanby Island, from where 83 survivors would later be saved by the destroyer Mochizuki and Izokadze. However, since I have already talked too much today, I refuse to do anything else other than the aftermath of the battle. We will return to Goodenough Island at the end of October 1942, don't worry. Milne Bay was a strategic victory for the Allies, being able to repel the Japanese and saving the airfields from enemy occupation. The Allies expanded the base, adding 2 6.1-inch coastal artillery guns. Number 1 airfield received a second runway, this time made of bitumen. The port was expanded and was able to receive both Liberty cargo ships and destroyers. By the end of the year, there was also a PT boat base. It became a staging area, and there was also a station hospital there. The base would come under attack in April 1943 during Operation Aigo by Japanese planes, but the base suffered minor damage. It would later be used as a staging point for the landing at Lae in September 1943 and the new Britannic campaign in December of that year. As far as losses go, the Australians suffered 373 casualties, of which 167 killed or missing in action. The Americans lost 14 deaths and several wounded. The Japanese were now in a very bad spot. The strategy after the defeat of Milne Bay would be to destroy the Allied in the Solomon Island, leaving just a small force under Major General Hori in the Kokoda track. After eliminating the Allied in Guadalcanal, the Japanese would be able to reinforce Hori and try again maybe towards Port Moresby. Now they could not do this as they were too much overextended. Milne Bay was probably the first Japanese defeat on land, and it greatly helped in improving Allied morale, both in the troops and in the home front. The seriousness of the fight is also highlighted by the number of awards given, including 2 Victoria Crosses out of a total of 21 given in the entire war to Australian troops, 1 at Isurava and 1 in Milne Bay. We now end the video with the Japanese slowly advancing towards Port Moresby on the Kokoda track. Will this advance continue or will they be stopped? Thank you for watching, and remember to always bring more than one radio in case you get stranded on a remote island.